for any of these start us off?
We are asked about that the screen of these dancers that is not mentioned in your sharing earlier on.
Yeah.
You are director of that show, right? I'm interested in the style of dancers and how did it match with the experience of the whole show? It's kind of like it's very entertaining, but yet it's group dance. I just want you to comment on that.
So it's a video that started with, I think I also alluded to it in my presentations where, and also Doc's mentioned it in the introduction about my practice, that sometimes I use archives as a point of departure, which is similar to you, right? You're looking at archives. And so when I was a kid in Hong Kong, then my father came to UK first, and at that time the man had to establish himself, and then everybody could come over. So as a kid, I had all these archive photographs, and I felt to be a curator of arranging photographs to make stories. But I found one photograph of my cousin who didn't go to Hong Kong, so he and my uncle and auntie remained in Guangdong province. And it's a photograph of him as a 19-year-old in a labor camp in Hainan Island, sat like this, holding a radio. You see the photograph in the video. So he's holding a radio, and I'm 7, and I was curious about the photograph, but I just left it alone. I was too young. And then as an adult and as an artist, I then revisited that photograph, and I went to China to collaborate with him and specifically asked him about this photograph. And that's when he said that it's not a radio, it's a brick painted to look like a radio with a bamboo shoot stuck to look like an aerial. So there is this thing about believing video and film and photography, or questioning it and finding out more. And so, knowing that it's a brick, I then said to him, so did you hear anything? And he said, yeah. I said, well, what did you hear? And he said, well, I heard the love theme from the Hollywood classic, Dr. Zhivago. And I am convinced it's not possible for him to have heard it, not just about it being a brick, but about the conditions of China at that time. I'm just convinced that he could not have heard it. It just was not available to hear. So how did he know? But he hummed it. And so then I looked at that song, and when I went onto YouTube, I found about 150 versions of that song. So if you don't know, you can't know the authenticity of the one that you're listening to, unless you do know. So which one did he hear? And which one did he imagine? Did he hear the authentic original one? Or did he hear the disco one? Or did he hear the Cantonese version one? It's all in the video. So there's 3 versions in that video. And one of them happens to be a white disco version. Because black disco and white disco is not the same thing. So when I was growing up in UK, there was this whole thing. You might find this familiar. There's this whole thing about some people idolizing John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever because he had won the competition in film. But the couple before that couple were brilliant dancers, but they were not white, so they didn't win. And there was this thing in the 70s where there was a thing like white disco, which is kind of a bit lame. It's just not hardcore enough. You know, it's not getting to the point. Whereas if you actually listen to the proper stuff, you know, as I played it, within second you're into the groove, right? You're just, yeah, I'm in. So there is this me sort of playing with genres of music. So that's my sort of criticism of, yeah, you don't want to listen to that, listen to this instead. So that's.
Are there any other questions?
So that's kind of what it is. It's me having a dig. But basically in the 70s, but not digging it, yeah. So in the 70s, before MTV and before music video, if Top of the Pops played a record, but they couldn't afford to bring Michael Jackson to the UK BBC studios, they would have these dancers sort of responding to the song. So there's something to look at. And at the time, so I'm imitating that period. And you see his mask, you see my cousin's mask, and then you see these girls dancing. And I recruited really good dancers, and I said to them, don't dance well. But dance like they did in the 70s in a bad way to that disco.
That's such a great piece. I really love that work. I enjoyed writing about it. So we have any other questions for any of the artists? Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, because all of you, or particularly you and Susan, spoke about your personal experience of growing up here in this country and how you started to develop your artistic practice, but also informed by your own personal experience of being someone of Chinese heritage. And as the recent kind of evolution of identity politics, and also this post-colonial awakening discussion and actions being taken, what is your take on the recent phenomenon, and how do you think the recent identity politics and post-colonial thinking have changed or informed your artistic practice? And I think for Maria, I think, well, obviously you are from Singapore and of Chinese heritage, and I think the question for you is how do you see the whole kind of global picture of post-colonial thinking and identity politics, and how that has informed your work? Because obviously your perspective might be slightly different. Yours might be more, probably less related to living in the UK as such. So this is just a broad question for all of you. I'm quite curious.
So, I guess, sorry, yeah. I guess to answer that, for me, I would like to just tell you about what happened to me here. I should have exhibited this work a few years ago, but there was a whole sort of political civil war. Those who know will know. It was bloodbath in the UK to do with this place. It was wild, and I was kind of in the middle of it because I was invited to do the show, and then the whole community were, you know, and I was thinking, what the hell? Just want to do a show, you know. So that whole thing collapsed, and also it collapsed with COVID. So then I had all my material. I hadn't made the work yet, but I just had this stuff. The stuff was in some garage in Salford, where the guy's fixing cars, but he's got a spare garage, and I had all my stuff there. But it kept going on where you know, am I doing this or not? And in the end, I just got rid of all the stuff. I couldn't keep this garage anymore. But kind of in answer to your question about where I am, is that then something really interesting happened when the team were writing the text about me, so that when you guys come, you can read the text. And the team were writing the biographical statement, and the team were asking me, okay, should we write Dinh Yi Li, British Hong Kong Chinese artist living in Cornwall? Should we do that? And that's the normal thing as the opening sentence. And Xiao Wen said, just call him an artist. And that's what they did. And I think that's a good way to sort of answer that question. I think it's so tiring. It's so tiring to, and it's not an easy thing to unravel, because we do need these centres. Because without these organisations and centres, then there's less platform. There's less of a launching pad to go and do your thing. There's just less. But we want those ones who understand in the way that Xiao Wen understands, whereas like, just call the person an artist. And that's where it's at, I think, for me.
That, for me, was where I was at in the 90s. So actually it's really unusual for me to refer to my personal experience at all. So a significant shift for me in making this piece, Centenary, was to bring seem to bring my personal experience into it. It's something that I've avoided for 30 years. And this is because when I was at art school and post, mid-90s, this was kind of post-80s black art movement, thick of the YBA scene. I was thinking about strategies of identification and non-identification, and one of the first opportunities I had to introduce myself in a public context, and in response to and in anticipation of the expectation that you name yourself, identify yourself as an XYZ artist, I said, well, and I wasn't a YBA, so I introduced myself as a YBCCA, YDAR, WBA, like young black British it's like, well, I'm not that, but I'm many things that can't be contained. So I've been playing around with that multiplicity, or finding ways to play against that expectation since I came out of art school. And I think actually the framing of this afternoon, speaking out by, and the invocation of Trinh Minh-ha was really resonant for me, because it was discovering Trinh Minh-ha's filmmaking and writing in the 90s that really opened up pathways for me, spaces to think and situate myself differently. Not am I British, Chinese, young, black, politically Chinese, British, none of those things. The kind of thinking, the theoretical framing, the philosophical kind of the different way of being, different ways of being that were invoked by Trinh Minh-ha's writing, Yen Ang's writing, Ray Chow's writing, were hugely, Teresa Hapkin-Cha, in the 90s, reading their work, hot off the slow publication press. That was how I situated myself. So I think that so much has changed and very little has changed. There are so many, going back to the question about generational shifts, geographical shifts, it's significant that we no longer have the word centre here, because there are many centres, and those centres also need to be decentered. So I think that for me there isn't a linear, we were there then, this is where we are now. We keep circling back, necessarily so, to listen again. I hope that we are all listening again, and again and again. And we may be calling things different things, framing things slightly differently, but I think many of us are tussling with the same questions, and there was a moment for me of realising, there were moments of realising that conversations were still going on, and they're depressingly or otherwise very similar conversations, exchanges to those that were happening 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago. But they are absolutely necessary. So that was a significant moment of recognition for me, just because I had done a certain bit of working through for myself. Didn't mean that was solved over. It very much isn't. Because I see my kids too, third generation, mixed heritage, contending in their own ways with a whole bunch of other related, but from their specific experiences, related questions. So I try to respond to the broad with the specific and the located.
Yeah, it's a complicated question because Singapore is a rather kind of peculiar post-colonial condition. I guess, I mean, the situations are quite different, but I mean, there's of course some parallels that you can draw with Hong Kong, for example, given that both were British colonies. And in Singapore, there's at some level not, until quite recently, very little critical scrutiny towards that legacy, which is very peculiar given that Singapore did gain independence in the 1960s on the wave of the anti-colonial movement. So there was anti-colonial movement that eventually delivered full sovereignty. But if you go around Singapore today, you would notice that there are these statues of this colonialist called Stamford Raffles, who has been elevated as the kind of founder of modern Singapore. And for the longest time, our history textbooks would begin with the year of our colonization, 1819. And a few years ago was the 200th, the bicentennial, in which we also, it was indeed a celebration because that was the campaign of the tourism board to brand it as a thing to celebrate. But then there was some kind of course, people protested, but it wasn't like it didn't reach any kind of mainstream level of protest. But of course, people who were aware, of course, protested. And it's a bit better these days. The history books have kind of extended the starting point a little further back. But there is, I think, but also this post-colonial condition has to be also kind of historicized. And there is a particular moment that I often bring up, which was a moment in the 60s, and that was when our Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew invited the Dutch economist Albert Winseman to Singapore. Of course, this was a whole period where these post-colonial nations, or Singapore especially, was inviting these foreign experts to kind of come in and give advice on how to develop the country. And that was when it promoted a kind of foreign investment-led development strategy for Singapore, which is very, very different from Japan and South Korea, which was mostly led by domestic industries. For Singapore, the strategy was to open up to foreign investors. And Albert Winseman told Lee Kuan Yew, he presented his plan, his proposals, how Singapore can industrialize. And he said, all of this wouldn't matter unless you did two things. Firstly, you had to get rid of the communists. I don't care how you get rid of them, you can throw them to prison, you can kill them. As an economist, the methods don't really matter to me. But all I know is that if you have them in the system, you are not going to develop. This was a very Dutch guy, typical Dutch technocratic imaginary. Number two, he said, do not tear down the statue of Stamford Raffles as they do in India and in Indonesia to their former colonizers. Keep the statue there to show that you are open to foreign investment and that you are open to investments from Britain, from Germany, from anywhere in the world, because we will need their expertise to industrialize, etc. So Lee Kuan Yew pretty much fulfilled both conditions. In fact, we built a second statue, like a replica in the 70s, of Stamford Raffles. So there are actually two versions of Stamford Raffles.
How far apart?
Just walking distance. just walking.
Reinforce the point.
So it's quite remarkable. So it's like just 10 years ago, you had this anti-colonial movement to basically get them out of the country, and 10 years later, suddenly they were welcomed back, taking on a very different role. And so it like for me, we continue to inherit this legacy, which was and this kind of uncritical acceptance of that legacy that was really forged out of this economic pragmatism, so to speak, of that was decided upon by Lee Kuan Yew and his team of politicians who were running the country at that time. And I think it's only and so obviously when we see statues being toppled here in the UK, and then I realize the ones in Singapore are not going to be touched at all.
Are you thinking about Colston?
Oh, what?
Do you think about Colston in Bristol?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Obviously the younger generation in Singapore are very aware of these movements, and of course that leads to a sort of reflection on why this statue is still standing in Singapore, but I doubt it's going to fall anytime soon.
Shocking.
Yeah.
But also, I would also say that Singapore's experience with colonial, I think colonialism is also not like a homogeneous experience, and if you understand that Singapore as a port city experienced also a very different forms of colonialism, in the sense that there were no natural resources to be extracted, very, very little. So the kinds of, you didn't see the forms of direct attraction. The Singapore as a port city was also primarily a city of immigrants. And of course I would come up from that history. Chinese are not native to Singapore, although they now are the majority of the population. So it's a country of settlers, but the settlers are not from the kind of colonial, are not from kind of colonial metropole, so to speak. And because of that, it's a very different kind of anti-colonial movement that emerges, because people who came to Singapore at that time, they were sojourners, they didn't even have the idea of, wanting to stay here. And if you see Singapore as a very temporary space, of course you have a much more transactional relationship with this city. You wouldn't, but of course, it was only in the 50s and the 60s there was a kind of burgeoning national consciousness that then gave people says, no, my home is in Malaya, my home is in Singapore, and how am I going to, defend it? How do I secure autonomy for ourselves? And this, of course, is very different from, other parts of the empire where, you're talking about land that was, extracted for its resources and completely depleted. Whereas Singapore, it was, as a port city, it became very, very wealthy. And essentially, when the new government, when the kind of Singaporean, the independent government took over, a lot of what it has done in terms of its economic policy is really to continue those set of British policies, which is all about free trade, all about free markets, and basically inherited wholesale, but just under a Singaporean government. And to a certain extent, that is a direct colonial lineage that defines the Singapore economic model today.
Thank you all. I think we're just out of time now, but please welcome me in thanking our three brilliant artists today.